Hello, everyone, and welcome to our channel. We're so glad you've joined us today for another deep dive into history. Please take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's journey back in time. The narrative of early American history is often painted with broad strokes, particularly when it comes to the arrival of Europeans and their interactions with the indigenous populations. Among the most pervasive of these strokes is what historians refer to as the Black Legend. This term conjures images of unbridled Spanish cruelty, fanaticism, and rapacious greed, portraying the conquest and colonization of the Americas as an unmitigated tale of destruction and oppression. It's a powerful, enduring narrative that has significantly shaped perceptions of Spain's role in the New World, not just in the minds of its historical rivals, but within the very fabric of American historical understanding. But what exactly is the Black Legend? Where did it come from? And how accurately does it reflect the complex realities of the encounter between Native Americans and Spaniards? To truly understand this, we must peel back layers of propaganda, historical bias, and genuine human suffering, acknowledging that history is rarely, if ever, a monolithic truth. Our journey begins by setting the stage not just in the Old World, but in the vibrant, diverse, and often highly sophisticated civilizations that thrived across the Americas long before Columbus ever set sail. It's crucial to recognize that the lands the Spaniards encountered were not empty wildernesses awaiting European dominion. They were homelands to millions, intricate societies with their own political structures, economies, spiritual beliefs, and artistic expressions. From the dense rainforests of the Amazon to the arid deserts of the American Southwest, from the sprawling urban centers of Mesoamerica to the intricate mound-building cultures of the Mississippi Valley, a kaleidoscope of human experience flourished. These were societies that had developed complex agricultural systems, including the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, which sustained vast populations. They had engineered impressive architectural feats, like the pyramids of Teotihuacan or the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. They possessed profound astronomical knowledge, intricate writing systems, and rich oral traditions. Their social structures ranged from egalitarian tribal groups to highly stratified empires, each with its unique customs and values. Understanding the sheer diversity and complexity of these pre-Columbian societies is paramount, as it immediately challenges any simplistic narrative of a discovery of an empty or primitive land. Instead, it frames the encounter as a collision of two vastly different yet equally developed worlds, each with its own strengths, weaknesses, and internal conflicts. The stage was set for a transformative and often tragic chapter in human history, one that would redefine continents and cultures for centuries to come. The Black Legend, in its stark simplicity, often overlooks this rich tapestry of indigenous life, reducing Native Americans to passive victims or savage obstacles rather than active participants in a rapidly changing world. Our exploration aims to move beyond such simplistic portrayals, seeking a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of this pivotal era, recognizing the agency and resilience of indigenous peoples in the face of unprecedented challenges. This journey will require us to confront uncomfortable truths, challenge long-held assumptions, and embrace the complexities that define the human story. So let us begin our inquiry, not with judgment, but with curiosity, striving to understand the multifaceted interactions that shaped the American continent and its peoples. Before the thunder of European ships and the clang of Spanish steel echoed across the Atlantic, the Americas were home to an astonishing mosaic of civilizations, each with its unique identity and legacy. These were not primitive peoples awaiting enlightenment, but sophisticated societies that had navigated their environments, built complex social structures, and created profound cultural expressions for millennia. In Mesoamerica, stretching from central Mexico down to northern Costa Rica, the Olmec, Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacan, and later the Aztec empires flourished, leaving behind awe-inspiring architectural marvels like the pyramids of El Mirador or the sprawling city of Tenochtitlan. The Maya, for instance, developed advanced astronomical observations, an intricate hieroglyphic writing system, and a sophisticated calendar that rivaled and, in some aspects, surpassed contemporary European systems. Their city-states were centers of trade, learning, and religious ceremony, interconnected by complex political alliances and occasional warfare. Further south, in the rugged Andean highlands of South America, the Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, represented the zenith of pre-Columbian political and administrative organization. From their capital in Cusco, the Inca ruled a vast domain stretching thousands of miles along the spine of the Andes, connecting diverse ecological zones through an impressive network of roads and suspension bridges. They managed a highly centralized economy, distributing resources through a sophisticated system of tribute and reciprocity, and employed the quipo, a system of knotted cords for record-keeping and possibly narrative. Their engineering prowess allowed them to construct formidable fortresses like Sacsayhuaman and agricultural terraces that transformed steep mountainsides into productive farmland. Across North America, indigenous peoples exhibited an equally remarkable range of adaptations and innovations. The ancestral Puebloans of the Southwest constructed multi-story cliff dwellings and pueblos like those at Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, demonstrating remarkable architectural skill and resourcefulness in arid environments. They developed intricate irrigation systems and maintained complex spiritual practices centered around kivas. In the Mississippi Valley, the Mississippian cultures, perhaps best exemplified by Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis, built massive earthen mounds that serve as platforms for temples and elite residences, creating urban centers with populations rivaling European cities of the time. These societies engaged in extensive trade networks, exchanging goods like copper, shells, and obsidian across vast distances. The eastern woodlands, home to groups like the Iroquois Confederacy, developed complex political systems characterized by councils and confederations, demonstrating principles of democratic governance long before European arrival. Their societies were often matrilineal, with women holding significant power and influence. The diversity extended to their spiritual beliefs, which were deeply intertwined with the natural world, emphasizing interconnectedness, reciprocity, and the sacredness of all life. Storytelling, ceremonies, and art forms were integral to transmitting knowledge, history, and values across generations. These pre-Columbian worlds were not static. They were dynamic, evolving, and often engaged in their own internal conflicts, migrations, and periods of rise and fall. They were vibrant societies, full of human ingenuity, resilience, and profound wisdom. The arrival of Europeans would thrust these diverse worlds into an unprecedented era of change, conflict, and cultural exchange, dramatically altering the course of their histories and setting the stage for the complex narrative that would later be framed by the Black legend. Understanding this richness is key to appreciating the immense loss, but also the incredible resilience that defined the subsequent centuries. The dawn of October 12, 1492, marked an indelible turning point in world history, a moment when the distant ripples of European ambition finally broke upon the shores of the Americas. Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing under the banner of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, believed he had reached the East Indies. Instead, he landed on an island in the Caribbean, likely Guanahani in the Bahamas, which he promptly renamed San Salvador. This arrival initiated an encounter that would forever alter the destinies of continents and peoples. Columbus's initial interactions with the indigenous Taíno people were at first glance marked by a curious blend of wonder and strategic calculation. His diaries describe the Taíno as naked as their mothers bore them, and very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. He noted their generosity, stating, "They are so ingenuous and free with all they have that no one would believe it who has not seen it. Of anything they have, if you ask them for it, they never say no." However, beneath this veneer of fascination lay a clear imperial agenda. Columbus's primary directives were twofold: to find a sea route to Asia for trade and to discover gold and other valuable resources. His very first observations quickly turned to the potential for exploitation. He wrote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." This ominous statement laid bare the true nature of the Spanish enterprise. The Taíno, unaccustomed to European diseases, weaponry, or the concept of absolute private ownership of land, were ill-equipped to resist the encroaching forces. Within a few short years, the initial peaceful exchanges devolved into brutal subjugation. Columbus established the first European settlement, La Navidad, on Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic, and introduced the infamous encomienda system, a legal framework that granted Spanish colonists the right to demand labor and tribute from indigenous people in exchange for protection and Christian instruction. In practice, it became a thinly veiled system of forced labor and servitude, often leading to extreme cruelty and exploitation. The search for gold became an obsession. Indigenous people were forced into mines, enduring back-breaking labor under inhumane conditions. Those who resisted or failed to meet quotas faced severe punishments, including mutilation and death. The demographic catastrophe that followed was unprecedented. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity, swept through populations with devastating speed. Combined with the violence, forced labor, starvation, and social disruption caused by the Spanish presence, the indigenous population of Hispaniola, estimated to be hundreds of thousands or even millions at the time of Columbus's arrival, plummeted to a mere few thousand within decades. The Caribbean, once a vibrant collection of indigenous societies, became a crucible of colonial ambition and indigenous suffering, setting a grim precedent for subsequent Spanish expansion across the mainland. This initial chapter, marked by the rapid decline of the Taíno and the establishment of coercive labor systems, provided fertile ground for the narratives that would later form the core of the Black legend, casting a long, dark shadow over the legacy of Christopher Columbus and the earliest days of Spanish colonization.
The early 16th century witnessed a dramatic escalation of Spanish ambition as the conquistadors turned their gaze from the Caribbean islands to the vast, wealthy mainland. The most iconic and perhaps most infamous of these campaigns was the conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés. In 1519, Cortés, defying the orders of the governor of Cuba, set sail for the Yucatan Peninsula with a small force of around 500 soldiers, a handful of cannons, and 16 horses. What he encountered was the powerful Triple Alliance, dominated by the Mexica people, commonly known as the Aztecs, whose capital, Tenochtitlan, was a magnificent island city, larger and more sophisticated than many European cities of the time. Cortés's success was not simply a matter of military superiority, though European steel, gunpowder, and horses certainly provided a significant tactical advantage. His genius lay in his cunning political maneuvering and his ability to exploit the deep-seated resentments and rivalries that existed within the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, while powerful, ruled over a vast network of tribute states, many of whom chafed under their dominance and resented the demands for tribute and sacrificial victims. Upon landing, Cortés quickly encountered the Totonac people, who were eager to throw off Aztec rule. He forged an alliance with them, gaining invaluable intelligence and a significant number of indigenous auxiliaries. His most crucial alliance, however, came with the Tlaxcalans, a fierce and independent people who had long resisted Aztec hegemony. The Tlaxcalans, numbering in the tens of thousands, became indispensable allies, providing not only warriors but also logistical support and knowledge of the terrain. Another pivotal figure in Cortés's campaign was Malintzin, or Malinche, a Nahua woman enslaved and given to Cortés. She became his translator, advisor, and mistress, proving invaluable in navigating the complex political landscape and communicating with various indigenous groups. Her role is highly controversial, seen by some as a traitor to her people, and by others as a survivor making the best of impossible circumstances. As Cortés marched inland, burning his ships to prevent retreat and signaling his unwavering commitment, he was perceived by some as a god, or at least a powerful harbinger, fulfilling prophecies of the return of the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl. This perception, coupled with his reputation for ruthlessness, contributed to a climate of fear and uncertainty among the Aztecs. Upon reaching Tenochtitlan, Emperor Moctezuma II, wary of these strange newcomers, initially welcomed Cortés, perhaps hoping to control them or appease them. This decision proved fatal. Cortés seized Moctezuma, effectively holding the Aztec emperor hostage and attempting to rule through him. The situation eventually erupted into open warfare. During the Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows, in 1520, the Spanish were forced to retreat from Tenochtitlan, suffering heavy losses. However, Cortés regrouped with his Tlaxcalan allies and, after a brutal siege lasting 75 days, during which disease, starvation, and relentless fighting decimated the Aztec defenders, Tenochtitlan fell in August 1521. The once grand city was laid to waste, its temples razed, and its people decimated. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the effective end of the Aztec Empire and the beginning of New Spain, a vast colonial enterprise built upon the ashes of a once mighty civilization. The immense wealth of gold and silver plundered from the Aztecs fueled Spanish coffers and further cemented their reputation for insatiable greed, contributing significantly to the emerging narrative of the Black Legend.
Hot on the heels of Cortés's triumph in Mesoamerica, another audacious Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, set his sights on the even vaster and wealthier Inca Empire in South America. Inspired by rumors of immense riches to the south, Pizarro, a seasoned but ruthless veteran of colonial campaigns, embarked on his fateful expedition in 1532 with an astonishingly small force, fewer than 200 men, a few dozen horses, and a handful of cannons. The Inca Empire, or Tawantinsuyu, was a sprawling and highly organized civilization, stretching thousands of miles along the Andes Mountains. However, Pizarro arrived at a moment of profound vulnerability for the Inca. The empire had just emerged from a devastating civil war between two half-brothers, Huáscar and Atahualpa, vying for the imperial throne. Atahualpa had emerged victorious, but the conflict had left the empire weakened, internally divided divided and susceptible to external threats. Furthermore, European diseases, particularly smallpox, had already preceded Pizarro, devastating Inca populations and even claiming the life of the previous emperor, Huayna Capac, further contributing to the instability. Pizarro, like Cortés, was a master of deception and psychological warfare. He invited Atahualpa to a meeting in the city of Cajamarca, promising a peaceful parley. Atahualpa, confident in his power and surrounded by thousands of his unarmed retainers, walked into a trap. On November 16, 1532, as Atahualpa arrived in the main casa, the Spanish friar Vicente del Valverde approached him, offering him a Bible and demanding he convert to Christianity and swear fealty to the Spanish king. When Atahualpa, who had no concept of a written word or the Christian God, reportedly threw the Bible to the ground, Pizarro gave the prearranged signal. The Spanish soldiers, hidden in the surrounding buildings, unleashed a volley of gunfire and charged on horseback, creating utter chaos and panic among the unarmed Inca. The ensuing massacre was swift and brutal. Thousands of Inca were slaughtered, and Atahualpa was captured. This audacious act, known as the Battle of Cajamarca, decapitated the Inca leadership and threw the empire into disarray. Pizarro, holding Atahualpa captive, demanded an unprecedented ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver. The Inca, desperate to free their emperor, painstakingly gathered immense quantities of precious metals from across their vast empire. Despite fulfilling the ransom, Pizarro, fearing Atahualpa's continued influence and potential for rallying resistance, orchestrated a sham trial and had him executed by garrote in July 1533. With Atahualpa dead and the empire in chaos, Pizarro marched on the Inca capital of Cusco, which fell in November 1533. The Spanish systematically plundered the city's immense wealth, melting down intricate gold and silver artifacts, many of immense cultural and artistic value, into crude ingots for shipment back to Spain. Resistance continued for decades, notably from Manco Inca Yupanqui, who established a neo-Inca state in Vilcabamba, but the centralized power of the Inca Empire was broken. The conquest of the Inca, even more so than the Aztec conquest, highlighted the Spanish ruthlessness and insatiable hunger for gold. The deception at Cajamarca and the subsequent execution of Atahualpa, despite the ransom, became enduring symbols of Spanish treachery and contributed heavily to the growing narrative of the Black Legend, painting a picture of conquerors devoid of honor or mercy. This era of conquest established a pattern of resource extraction, forced labor, and the decimation of indigenous populations that would define Spanish colonial rule for centuries. With the major indigenous empires overthrown, Spain embarked on the colossal task of establishing a vast colonial empire in the Americas. This was not merely about conquest, but about creating a new society, a new Spain, built upon the ruins of the old. The crown's primary goal was to extract wealth, primarily gold and silver, and to evangelize the indigenous populations, converting them to Catholicism. To achieve these aims, a complex administrative and economic system was in place, centered on the exploitation of indigenous labor and resources. The foundational institution of early Spanish colonial rule was the encomienda system, first implemented in the Caribbean and then extended to the mainland. As discussed, it granted Spanish encomenderos the right to indigenous labor and tribute from specific communities in exchange for protection and religious instruction. While theoretically designed to civilize and Christianize, in practice it often devolved into brutal servitude, resembling slavery. Encomenderos frequently overworked their indigenous charges, provided inadequate food and shelter, and subjected them to horrific punishments. The demographic collapse due to disease only intensified the pressure on the dwindling indigenous workforce, leading to even more desperate measures by the encomenderos. As reports of widespread abuses reached the Spanish crown, and under pressure from humanitarian voices like Bartolomé de las Casas, whom we will discuss shortly, the encomienda system faced increasing scrutiny. In an attempt to mitigate the worst excesses, the crown gradually introduced reforms, most notably the new laws of 1542, which aimed to curb the power of the encomenderos and prevent the inheritance of encomiendas. While these laws met with fierce resistance from the colonists and were often difficult to enforce, they signaled the crown's desire to assert more direct control over its American territories and to regulate, if not eliminate, the exploitation. Replacing or complementing the encomienda system was the repartimento system, known as the mita in Peru. This system mandated that indigenous communities provide a fixed percentage of their male population for labor on public works projects, in mines, or on Spanish farms for a certain period each year. While it was theoretically a rotating draft with wages, in reality, the wages were often meager, the working conditions brutal, and the time away from their villages disruptive to indigenous life and agriculture. The repartimiento, particularly in the silver mines of places like Potosí, became a primary engine of colonial wealth extraction, but at a devastating human cost. To govern this vast empire, Spain established a hierarchical administrative structure. Viceroyalties, initially two, New Spain, Mexico and Central America, and Peru, South America, were created, headed by viceroys who served as the king's direct representatives and held immense power. Below them were audiencias, high courts, governors and corregidores, local administrators, forming a complex bureaucracy designed to enforce royal decrees, collect taxes, and administer justice. This system, while centralized, often struggled with the vast distances, slow communication, and the inherent corruption and self-interest of local officials. The establishment of these systems marked a profound transformation of the Americas. Indigenous political structures were dismantled or subordinated, traditional land ownership patterns were disrupted, and the very fabric of indigenous society was rewoven into the colonial tapestry. This process was far from smooth, marked by resistance, rebellion, and a continuous struggle for survival by the Native American populations, all contributing to the stark imagery that fueled the Black legend. While Spanish steel and gunpowder certainly played a role in the conquest of the Americas, the most devastating weapon in the European arsenal was one they didn't even know they carried: disease. The arrival of Europeans introduced a host of pathogens: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, diphtheria, malaria, and yellow fever, to which Native Americans had no prior exposure and therefore no acquired immunity. The consequences were catastrophic, leading to a demographic collapse on a scale unprecedented in human history. Imagine a continent populated by millions, suddenly swept by invisible plagues against which their bodies had no defense. The first major epidemic, likely smallpox, hit Hispaniola in 1518, decimating the already suffering Taíno population. From there, it spread like wildfire. When Cortés marched into Mexico, smallpox had already reached Tenochtitlan ahead of him, weakening the Aztec defense by killing a significant portion of the population, including possibly Emperor Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor. Similarly, smallpox ravaged the Inca Empire even before Pizarro's arrival, contributing to the civil war that so weakened the empire by claiming the lives of Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir. The impact of these diseases was not merely a matter of mortality, it was a complete societal breakdown. Entire villages were wiped out, social structures crumbled as leaders, healers, and elders died en masse. Agricultural systems collapsed as there were no longer enough hands to tend the fields, leading to widespread famine. Survivors were left traumatized, disoriented, and vulnerable. The psychological toll was immense, as traditional spiritual beliefs struggled to explain such widespread suffering, leading some to question their gods and traditions, making them more susceptible to Christian conversion. estimating the precise pre-Columbian population of the Americas is a complex and highly debated topic, with figures ranging from tens of millions to over 100 million. However, there is a broad consensus among historians that within a century or two of European contact, indigenous populations declined by a staggering 80 to 95% across the continent. For example, the population of central Mexico, estimated at 25 million in 1519, had fallen to approximately 1 million by 1600. The Caribbean islands, once densely populated, became virtual ghost lands. This demographic catastrophe far outstripped the deaths caused by direct violence and forced labor, though these factors certainly exacerbated the crisis. The scale of death was so immense that it fundamentally reshaped the landscape, leading to reforestation in some areas as agricultural lands lay fallow and contributing to a temporary cooling of the global climate. The Great Dying, as some historians call it, was an unintentional yet profoundly impactful consequence of the Columbian exchange. While the Black legend often focuses on Spanish cruelty, it is this invisible killer, the European disease, that exacted the highest toll, forever altering the demographic and cultural fabric of the Americas. It is a stark reminder of the devastating, often unforeseen consequences of intercontinental contact, and a critical component in understanding the rapid subjugation of indigenous peoples, regardless of Spanish intent.
Beyond the invisible scourge of disease, the Spanish conquest and colonization were also characterized by direct violence and systematic exploitation, aspects that became central to the Black legend. While the scale of death from disease dwarfed that from warfare, the brutality and forced labor inflicted by the conquistadors and early colonists were undeniable and deeply traumatic for indigenous populations. Warfare was a constant feature of the conquest. From the initial skirmishes in the Caribbean to the prolonged sieges of Tenochtitlan and Cusco, Spanish military superiority, stemming from steel weapons, gunpowder, cannons, and horses, often proved decisive against indigenous forces armed with obsidian-edged clubs, bows, and spears. While Native Americans demonstrated immense bravery and tactical skill, they were often outmatched in direct confrontations. The violence was not limited to battlefield engagements. Massacres of non-combatants, often as a means of terrorizing and subjugating communities, were tragically common. For example, the Cholula massacre in 1519, where Cortez's forces, with their Tlaxcalan allies, killed thousands of unarmed Cholulans, served as a chilling warning to other indigenous groups. Punitive expeditions against rebellious or non-compliant communities often resulted in widespread destruction, the burning of villages, and the summary execution of leaders. The forced labor systems, the encomienda and later the repartimiento, were perhaps the most pervasive forms of exploitation. Indigenous people were compelled to work in the silver and gold mines, which became the economic lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. The conditions in these mines, particularly the infamous Potosi in Bolivia, were horrific. Laborers, often forced to work deep underground for long hours in cold, dark, and dangerous conditions, faced collapses, respiratory illnesses from dust and mercury poisoning, used in silver extraction, and inadequate nutrition. Mortality rates were exceptionally high, turning the mines into veritable death traps. Beyond mining, indigenous labor was essential for agriculture, building infrastructure, and serving in Spanish households. On plantations, Native Americans were forced to cultivate European crops like wheat and sugar, often displacing their traditional subsistence farming and leading to further food insecurity. The disruption of traditional agricultural cycles and the diversion of labor to Spanish enterprises contributed to famine and malnutrition, weakening populations already ravaged by disease. The Black legend often emphasizes the physical cruelty, torture, mutilation, and public executions,
While these acts certainly occurred and were documented by critics like Bartolomeo de las Casas, they were often part of a broader system of control and intimidation. The goal was not simply wanton destruction, but the systematic subjugation of peoples and the extraction of their labor and resources for the benefit of the Spanish crown and its colonists. The psychological toll of this violence and exploitation was immense. Generations grew up under foreign rule, witnessing the destruction of their sacred sites, the suppression of their languages and customs, and the constant threat of violence. Yet, despite the immense suffering, Indigenous peoples displayed remarkable resilience, adapting, resisting, and preserving aspects of their cultures in the face of overwhelming pressure. The stories of violence and exploitation, horrific as they were, are an undeniable part of the historical record and formed a crucial foundation for the Black legend's portrayal of Spanish brutality. They underscored the immense human cost of empire building and the stark realities of power imbalances in the age of exploration.
Integral to the Spanish colonial project, and intertwined with both conquest and exploitation, was the fervent desire to spread Catholicism. The Spanish crown saw itself as the champion of the true faith, blessed by God to extend the dominion of Christianity to the pagan lands of the New World. This religious imperative, often articulated as a justification for conquest, led to the establishment of a vast and influential ecclesiastical hierarchy in the Americas. Missions, churches, and monasteries became ubiquitous symbols of Spanish presence and power. The friars, Franciscans, Dominicans, Augustinians, and later Jesuits, were at the forefront of this evangelization effort. They ventured into remote areas, often preceding or accompanying the military, establishing missions that served not only as centers for religious conversion, but also as tools for cultural assimilation and economic production. Indigenous peoples were gathered into these missions, taught Christian doctrine, Spanish language, and European agricultural techniques and crafts. They were often compelled to abandon their traditional religious practices, which were deemed idolatrous by the friars. The conversion process was complex and often coercive. While some Indigenous people genuinely embraced Christianity, seeing parallels with their own spiritual beliefs, or finding solace in a new faith amidst societal collapse, many conversions were nominal or forced. Traditional deities and rituals were often suppressed, their images destroyed, and their practitioners persecuted. However, Indigenous peoples often found ways to syncretize or blend their ancestral beliefs with Christian practices. For example, the veneration of the Virgin Mary might be infused with elements of ancient earth goddesses, or Catholic saints might be associated with traditional spirits. This cultural blending resulted in unique forms of Christianity that persist in Latin America to this day. The church also played a significant role in colonial society beyond evangelization. It became a major landowner, accumulating vast estates through royal grants and donations. It operated schools, hospitals, and charities, providing some social services where the crown's administration was lacking. Ecclesiastical courts held significant power, dealing with matters of faith, morality, and even some civil disputes. However, the church was not a monolithic entity. While many friars and priests participated or benefited from the colonial system, there were also significant voices within the church who vehemently condemned the abuses against Indigenous peoples. These dissenting voices, often driven by theological principles and a genuine concern for the souls of the converted, became critical internal critics of Spanish colonial practices. Their writings and petitions to the crown provided much of the primary source material that later fueled the Black legend. The Inquisition, though less pervasive in the Americas than in Spain, also extended its reach, primarily targeting conversos, converted Jews, and, to a lesser extent, non-believers, ensuring doctrinal purity. The religious zeal of the Spanish, both in its missionary efforts and its internal critiques, showcases the complex motivations behind the conquest. It was not simply about gold, it was about God as well, a spiritual crusade that, while often leading to immense suffering and cultural destruction,
also gave rise to powerful internal debates about justice and humanity that would echo through the centuries. Amidst the relentless pursuit of gold and the fervent drive for conversion, a powerful dissenting voice emerged from within the Spanish ranks, one that would profoundly shape the historical record and provide crucial ammunition for the Black legend: Bartolomé de las Casas. Born in Seville in 1484, Las Casas initially came to the Americas as an encomendero and priest, participating in the early colonial enterprise in Hispaniola and Cuba. He witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of the encomienda system and the rapid decimation of the indigenous populations. A pivotal moment in his life occurred in 1514, when he experienced a profound spiritual conversion. He renounced his own encomienda, recognizing the inherent injustice and inhumanity of the system. From that point forward, he dedicated his life to advocating for the rights and humane treatment of Native Americans. Las Casas became a tireless champion for indigenous peoples, often traveling back to Spain to petition the crown and argue his case before the highest authorities. He believed that the indigenous peoples were rational beings, capable of salvation, and that their forced labor and enslavement were grave sins against God and natural law. He argued that conversion should be achieved through peaceful persuasion and example, not through violence and coercion. His most famous and influential work, Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, or A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, published in 1552, was a scathing indictment of Spanish cruelty in the Americas. In it, Las Casas meticulously detailed the atrocities he had witnessed and heard about: massacres, tortures, forced labor, the suffering in the mines, and the devastating impact of European diseases. He described the conquistadores as cruel tigers, wolves, and lions, and lamented the destruction of millions of lives. The short account was written with a clear polemical purpose: to shock the Spanish crown and European conscience into reforming colonial practices. Its vivid, often exaggerated descriptions of Spanish brutality were intended to provoke outrage and action. While Las Casas' intentions were noble, his work, translated and widely circulated throughout Europe, particularly by Spain's Protestant rivals, became a foundational text for the Black legend. Its stark portrayal of Spanish savagery was seized upon by English, Dutch, and French propagandists, who used it to demonize Spain, justify their own colonial ambitions, and present themselves as more benevolent alternatives. The impact of Las Casas' advocacy was significant. His lobbying efforts contributed directly to the promulgation of the new laws of 1542, which, as mentioned, attempted to abolish the encomienda system and protect indigenous rights, though their enforcement proved challenging. He also participated in the famous Valladolid debate, 1550-1551, against Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued for the natural inferiority of indigenous peoples and the justice of their subjugation. While the debate had no clear winner, it highlighted the profound moral and legal questions raised by the conquest within Spain itself. Despite his profound compassion for Native Americans, Las Casas was not without his flaws. In his early advocacy, he suggested the use of African slaves to alleviate the burden on indigenous populations, a position he later deeply regretted and condemned. Nevertheless, his legacy as a fierce defender of human rights in an era of immense brutality is undeniable. Las Casas' writings, born out of a genuine desire for justice, paradoxically became a potent tool in the hands of Spain's enemies, forever linking his name to the Black legend and shaping how the world viewed Spanish colonization for centuries. The criticisms voiced by figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, combined with the crown's desire to exert greater control over its increasingly powerful and independent colonists, led to a series of attempts at legal and administrative reforms in Spanish America. These reforms, while often met with fierce resistance and limited in their ultimate effectiveness, demonstrate that the Spanish crown was not entirely oblivious or indifferent to the abuses occurring in its overseas territories. The most significant of these reforms were the new laws of 1542. Promulgated by Emperor Charles V, these laws aimed to fundamentally reshape the relationship between the Spanish colonists and indigenous peoples. Key provisions included the gradual abolition of the encomienda system, preventing its inheritance by future generations, and placing indigenous communities under the direct protection of the crown. The new laws also sought to prevent the enslavement of indigenous peoples and to ensure fairer treatment, including the payment of wages for labor. The reaction from the colonists was immediate and furious. In Peru, the new law sparked a civil war among the conquistadors, as encomenderos, fearing the loss of their wealth and power, openly rebelled against royal authority. In New Spain, the viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, wisely chose to suspend the most controversial provisions to prevent a similar uprising, recognizing the practical impossibility of enforcing them without further destabilizing the fragile colony. While the new laws were ultimately watered down and their implementation uneven, they did signal a shift. The Crown's long-term goal was to replace the encomendera with the repartimiento system, as previously discussed, which, while still a form of forced labor, was theoretically more regulated and temporary, with labor drafts rotating among communities and for specific periods. This allowed the Crown to assert more direct control over indigenous labor and extract taxes directly, rather than through the encomenderos. Beyond these major legislative acts, the Spanish Crown also established the Council of the Indies in 1524, a powerful administrative body in Spain responsible for all matters related to the colonies. This council drafted laws, appointed officials, and served as the highest court of appeal for colonial affairs. Its existence underscored the Crown's commitment to centralized control and governance. Furthermore, a system of visitas, or inspections, and residencias, judicial reviews of officials at the end of their terms, was put in place to monitor colonial administration and hold officials accountable. While these mechanisms were often hampered by corruption, distance, and the vested interests of local elites, they were attempts to provide oversight and address grievances. The very existence of these reforms and the intense debates that surrounded them, such as the Valladolid debate, complicate the simplistic narrative of the Black legend. They reveal an internal Spanish discourse about justice, morality, and the proper treatment of indigenous peoples. It demonstrates that not all Spaniards were unrepentant villains, and that there was a genuine, albeit often ineffective, effort from the Crown to address the most egregious abuses. However, the persistent resistance from colonists, the vastness of the empire, and the sheer economic imperatives of silver extraction meant that the ideal of protection often succumbed to the harsh realities of exploitation. The reforms were a testament to the moral arguments of figures like Las Casas, but also a stark reminder of the immense power of colonial economic interests and the difficulty of reforming an entrenched system built on forced labor. They offer a more nuanced view of a colonial power grappling, however imperfectly, with the moral implications of its empire.
While God and glory were significant motivations for the Spanish conquest, it was arguably gold and silver that became the true economic engine of the vast Spanish Empire in the Americas. The discovery of immense silver deposits, particularly at Potosí in modern-day Bolivia in 1545 and Zacatecas in Mexico in 1546, transformed the colonial enterprise from one of plunder into a systematic, industrial-scale extraction operation. Potosí, a veritable mountain of silver, became the largest mining center in the world. Its wealth so staggering that its name became synonymous with immense riches. The silver extracted from these mines, and others across New Spain and Peru, poured into the Spanish treasury, funding Spain's wars in Europe, maintaining its vast bureaucracy, and fueling a burgeoning global trade network. This influx of precious metals had profound effects, not just for Spain, but for the entire world economy. It contributed to a phenomenon known as the price revolution in Europe, where a surge in the money supply led to inflation and significant economic shifts. It also cemented Spain's position as a dominant European power for over a century. The mining operations, however, came at an unimaginable human cost. Indigenous labor, primarily through the mita, repartimento system in Peru, and various forms of forced labor in Mexico, was the backbone of this industry.
thousands upon thousands of Native Americans were conscripted to work in the dangerous mines, often enduring appalling conditions, including extreme cold, lack of oxygen, tunnel collapses, and mercury poisoning used in the amalgamation process to extract silver from ore. Mortality rates were staggeringly high, turning the mines into sites of immense suffering and death. Beyond mining, the colonial economy was also built on agriculture. Large haciendas, estates, and plantations were established, often on lands seized from indigenous communities. These estates produced crops like wheat, sugar, indigo, cochineal, a valuable dye, and livestock, much of which was exported to Europe or supplied the growing colonial cities. Like mining, agriculture relied heavily on forced or coerced indigenous labor, and later, the labor of enslaved Africans. The Spanish also established a highly regulated transatlantic trade system known as the flota system. Heavily armed convoys of merchant ships, laden with silver, gold, and agricultural products, sailed from major colonial ports like Veracruz and Cartagena to Seville or Cadiz in Spain. On their return voyages, they carried European manufactured goods, luxury items, and tragically, enslaved Africans who became an increasingly vital labor force as indigenous populations continued to decline. This rigid system, designed to maximize royal revenues and prevent smuggling, fostered a closed, mercantilist economy where all trade was supposed to benefit the mother country directly. The wealth generated by the American colonies transformed Spain into a global superpower, but it also created a deeply unequal society in the Americas, with a small Spanish elite controlling vast resources and labor, while indigenous and African populations bore the brunt of the exploitation. The immense scale of wealth extraction, achieved through brutal labor practices, became a central tenet of the Black legend. It painted a picture of a rapacious colonial power driven solely by greed, confirming the narrative of Spanish cruelty and insatiable desire for riches, regardless of the human cost. The Spanish colonial enterprise in the Americas gave rise to a complex and rigid social hierarchy, a caste system known as the Sistema de Castas, designed to maintain Spanish dominance and define social status based on birth, race, and origin. This system, while fluid in practice in some regions, fundamentally structured colonial society and dictated access to power, wealth, and privilege. At the very pinnacle of this hierarchy were the peninsulares, individuals born in Spain, the Iberian Peninsula. They held the highest positions in government, the church, and the military, and controlled the most lucrative trade monopolies. Despite often being fewer in number, their proximity to the crown and their perceived racial purity granted them immense authority and prestige. Below them were the criollos, people of pure Spanish descent born in the Americas. While they could be wealthy landowners, mine owners, or merchants, and often formed the local elite, they were generally excluded from the highest echelons of political and ecclesiastical power, which was reserved for peninsulares. This inherent discrimination against criollos, despite their wealth and education, would eventually become a major source of tension and a driving force behind the independence movements of the 19th century. Below the criollos were the various castas, a bewildering array of mixed-race individuals. The most prominent among these were the mestizos, people of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Their position in society varied greatly depending on their specific lineage, wealth, and occupation. Some mestizos could attain a degree of social mobility, especially if they were educated or engaged in profitable trades, while others lived in poverty. They often served as artisans, small farmers, or overseers. The term mestizaje itself refers to the broader process of racial and cultural mixing that characterized Latin American societies. Below the mestizos were the indigenous populations, the Native Americans, who formed the vast majority of the population in many regions, particularly after the initial demographic collapse. Despite being the original inhabitants of the land, they occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder, subjected to forced labor, tribute payments, and legal discrimination. While the crown theoretically protected them as wards, Their daily reality was often one of exploitation and marginalization. They were often segregated into republics of Indians, self-governing communities under Spanish oversight, but still subject to colonial demands. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the enslaved Africans and their descendants. Brought to the Americas in chains to compensate for the declining indigenous labor force, they were considered chattel property and endured the most brutal forms of exploitation, primarily in mines and on plantations, especially in the Caribbean and coastal areas. Their legal status was that of property, with virtually no rights. The sistema de gastas was not just about race, it was about power and control. It created a rigid social order that reinforced colonial dominance, ensuring that wealth and authority remained concentrated in the hands of the European-born elite. While intermarriage and illicit relationships led to significant blurring of these lines over time, the underlying principles of racial hierarchy and discrimination persisted, profoundly shaping the social and cultural landscape of Latin America for centuries to come. This stark stratification, with the majority of the population subjugated and exploited, provided further evidence for the Black legend's portrayal of Spanish oppression and injustice.
Despite the overwhelming power of the Spanish Empire, the devastating impact of disease, and the imposition of coercive labor systems, Native American peoples were not passive victims. Throughout the colonial period, indigenous communities mounted diverse forms of resistance, ranging from open rebellion and armed conflict to subtle acts of cultural preservation and daily defiance. These acts of resistance, though often suppressed, demonstrated remarkable resilience and a persistent struggle for autonomy and survival. Open rebellions, while often crushed with brutal force, serve as powerful symbols of resistance. One of the most significant and successful was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico. Led by Pope, a Tewa religious leader, the Pueblo peoples, who had endured decades of Spanish religious persecution, forced labor, and drought, united across their diverse communities. They coordinated a surprise attack that drove the Spanish colonists, missionaries, and soldiers out of New Mexico entirely, forcing them to retreat south to El Paso. For 12 years, the Pueblos re-established their independence, revitalizing traditional religious practices and dismantling symbols of Spanish rule. While the Spanish eventually reconquered New Mexico in 1692, the Pueblo Revolt left an indelible mark, leading to a more nuanced and less oppressive Spanish colonial policy in the region thereafter, reflecting a recognition of indigenous power. Other significant rebellions occurred across the empire. In the Andes, various Inca resistance movements, like the Neo-Inca state, established in Vilcabamba by Manco Inca and his successors, continued to challenge Spanish authority for decades after the fall of Cusco. In Mexico, indigenous uprisings, though often localized, were a recurring feature of colonial rule, reflecting ongoing grievances against tribute, labor demands, and land encroachment. Beyond armed conflict, indigenous resistance also took more subtle, yet equally profound forms. Cultural resistance was paramount. Despite aggressive evangelization efforts, many communities secretly maintained their traditional religious beliefs, practicing syncretism, where indigenous deities or spirits were subtly blended with Catholic chants and rituals. Traditional languages, oral histories, and storytelling continued to be passed down through generations, preserving cultural identity in the face of assimilation pressures. Indigenous legal systems and forms of governance, while often subordinated, persisted within the Spanish framework. Communities would frequently engage in legal battles to defend their land rights, challenge unfair labor demands, and appeal to the crown for justice, often leveraging Spanish laws to their own advantage. This resistance through litigation was a sophisticated and often effective strategy. Everyday forms of resistance included foot dragging, feigned illness, sabotage of tools, flight to remote areas, forming cimarron or runaway communities, and even infanticide to prevent children from suffering under colonial rule. These individual acts of defiance, though small,
collectively undermined the efficiency of the colonial system and expressed a deep-seated rejection of Spanish authority. The resilience of Native American cultures, their ability to adapt, innovate, and preserve their heritage despite immense pressures, is a testament to their strength and perseverance. These acts of resistance, both overt and covert, challenge the narrative that indigenous peoples simply succumbed to Spanish power. They demonstrate agency, strategic thinking, and an unwavering commitment to their ways of life, adding crucial depth to the complex tapestry of the colonial period and providing a counterpoint to the victimization often implied by the Black legend. While the Spanish conquest brought immense suffering and disruption, it also initiated an unprecedented period of cultural exchange and blending, a phenomenon often referred to as mestizaje. This process, encompassing not only racial mixing, but also the fusion of languages, customs, foods, and religious practices, created the unique cultural landscape of Latin America that exists today. The most visible aspect of mestizaje was the intermingling of peoples. While Spanish colonial society was highly stratified by race, relationships, both forced and consensual, between Spaniards, indigenous peoples, and later Africans were common. This led to the emergence of the vast mixed-race populations, particularly mestizos, Spanish and indigenous, and mulattoes, Spanish and African, who would eventually form the demographic majority in many regions. These new racial categories, while initially assigned specific social positions within the caste system, also represented a blurring of lines and the creation of new identities. Language was another significant area of exchange. While Spanish became the dominant administrative and elite language, indigenous languages like Nahuatl, Quechua, and Guarani continued to be spoken by millions and often influenced local Spanish dialects, leading to a rich vocabulary incorporating indigenous words. Similarly, Spanish introduced new concepts and terms into indigenous languages. In the realm of food, the Columbian exchange was a two-way street. Europeans introduced wheat, rice, sugarcane, cattle, pigs, and chickens to the Americas, transforming agricultural practices and diets. In return, indigenous crops like maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, chilies, beans, squash, and chocolate traveled to Europe, revolutionizing global cuisine and agricultural production. Imagine Italian food without tomatoes, or Irish staples without potatoes. These were gifts from the Americas. This culinary exchange had profound global implications, significantly increasing food diversity and population growth worldwide. Religious syncretism, as touched upon earlier, was a powerful force. While the Spanish forcefully imposed Catholicism, indigenous spiritual beliefs often survived by being interwoven with Christian practices. The Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico, for instance, became a powerful symbol that blended pre-Columbian reverence for earth goddesses with Catholic Marian devotion, resonating deeply with indigenous and mestizo populations. Saints often acquired local meanings, and ancient rituals sometimes found expression within Catholic ceremonies. This blending created a uniquely Latin American Catholicism. Architecture, art, music, and literature also reflected this cultural synthesis. Colonial churches often incorporated indigenous motifs and craftsmanship, creating a distinct Baroque mestizo style. Indigenous artistic traditions, while suppressed in some forms, found new expression in Christian iconography. Musical instruments and forms from both traditions influenced each other, creating new sounds. The very concept of Latin American identity today is rooted in this complex process of mestizaje. It represents a vibrant fusion of diverse heritages, a testament to the adaptive capacity of human culture in the face of profound change. While the Black legend often focuses solely on the destructive aspects of Spanish colonization, the reality of cultural exchange and the emergence of new hybrid identities present a more nuanced and enduring legacy, highlighting the unforeseen consequences and creative outcomes of such a profound historical encounter. Having explored the realities of Spanish colonization in the Americas, it's time to delve deeper into the origins and proliferation of the Black legend itself. While the accounts of Las Casas provided powerful internal critiques, the Black legend as a widespread, enduring narrative primarily developed and was aggressively propagated by Spain's European rivals, particularly Protestant England and the Netherlands during the 16th and 17th centuries. In an era of intense religious conflict and imperial competition, demonizing Spain served multiple strategic purposes. Spain, at the height of its power, was the dominant Catholic force in Europe, vigorously defending its faith against the rising tide of Protestantism. The Spanish Armada's attempt to invade England in 1588 and Spain's relentless suppression of the Protestant revolt in the Netherlands, the 80 Years' War, made it a primary ideological and military adversary for these emerging Protestant nations. English and Dutch propagandists seized upon the accounts of Spanish cruelty in the Americas, often taking them out of context or exaggerating them, to paint Spain as an inherently cruel, fanatical, and tyrannical nation. This narrative served as a powerful tool to justify their own anti-Spanish policies and to rally public support for their wars against the Habsburg Empire. Pamphlets, engravings, and books depicting Spanish atrocities, often illustrated with graphic and sensational images, were widely circulated. These publications frequently used Las Casas's short account as their primary source, effectively turning a Spanish friar's plea for justice into a weapon against Spain itself. For example, Theodore de Brye's widely influential engravings, published in the late 16th century, graphically illustrated Las Casas's descriptions, creating enduring visual stereotypes of Spanish barbarity. The motivations behind this propaganda were clear. Firstly, it was a religious crusade. As Protestant nations, England and the Netherlands sought to portray Catholic Spain as morally corrupt and unchristian, contrasting it with their own perceived religious purity and benevolence. This helped to galvanize religious fervor against a common enemy. Secondly, it was a political strategy. By discrediting Spain's legitimacy and moral authority, these rival powers sought to undermine Spain's vast colonial empire and justify their own attempts to establish colonies in the Americas. If Spain was inherently tyrannical and cruel, then any attempt to challenge its dominion or even to liberate indigenous peoples from its clutches could be presented as a righteous endeavor. This narrative was particularly useful for the English, who were latecomers to the colonial game and needed to carve out their own space in a world already largely claimed by Spain and Portugal. The Black legend suggested that Spain's empire was built on injustice and therefore inherently unstable and ripe for challenge. Thirdly, it served economic interests. By portraying Spain as a nation obsessed with gold and silver and achieving it through brutal exploitation, the Black legend implicitly contrasted this with a more virtuous form of colonization that focused on trade, settlement, and agricultural development, as envisioned by English and Dutch proponents. This, of course, was often more aspirational than actual, as English and Dutch colonization also involved significant violence and exploitation. The Black legend was therefore not simply a historical account. It was a carefully constructed and politically charged narrative designed to serve the geopolitical, religious, and economic interests of Spain's rivals. Its enduring power lay in its simplicity and its ability to tap into existing prejudices, shaping European and later American perceptions of Spain for centuries to come, often overshadowing the complexities and nuances of the actual historical record. The propagation of the Black legend was far from an academic exercise. It was a potent weapon in the ongoing geopolitical struggles of early modern Europe. Its motivations were deeply rooted in the complex interplay of political, religious, and economic rivalries that defined the era. Spain's immense wealth, derived primarily from its American silver mines, allowed it to project unprecedented power across Europe. The Habsburg monarchs, particularly Charles V and Philip II, used this wealth to fund large armies and navies, pursue dynastic ambitions, and vigorously defend the Catholic faith against the Protestant Reformation. This made Spain the preeminent and often feared power of the 16th century. For emerging Protestant nations like England and the Dutch Republic, challenging Spanish hegemony was a matter of national survival and ambition. The Black Legend provided a moral and ideological justification for their opposition. Politically, by portraying Spain as a cruel and tyrannical oppressor, they could delegitimize Spanish claims to universal empire and present themselves as defenders of liberty and justice. This narrative was particularly effective in galvanizing public opinion and securing parliamentary or popular support for costly wars against Spain. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, for instance, drew heavily on narratives of Spanish oppression to rally support for their struggle for independence. Religiously, the Black Legend served as a powerful cudgel in the Protestant Reformation. Spain, as the bastion of the Counter-Reformation and the agent of the Inquisition, was depicted as the embodiment of Catholic fanaticism and barbarity. Stories of Spanish cruelty in the Americas were amplified and contrasted with the supposedly more enlightened and humane approach of Protestant colonizers, even though their own colonial practices would later prove equally, if not more, brutal. This religious dimension of the Black Legend was crucial, as it tapped into deep-seated theological anxieties and animosities. Economically, the Black Legend offered a rationale for challenging Spain's monopoly over American trade and colonization. If Spain's empire was founded on injustice and was inherently exploitative, then other European powers had a moral right, perhaps even a duty, to establish their own colonies and access the riches of the New World. This was particularly appealing to mercantile nations like England and the Netherlands, who sought to expand their own global trade networks and acquire overseas territories. The legend suggested that Spain's grip on the Americas was illegitimate, opening the door for rival claims. For example, when English privateers like Sir Francis Drake raided Spanish ships and ports, they could be portrayed not merely as pirates but as heroic figures, striking a blow against a tyrannical empire. The Black Legend provided a convenient narrative framework for these acts of piracy and later for direct colonial encroachment. Furthermore, the Black Legend often served to deflect criticism from the rival power's own nascent colonial endeavors. By focusing exclusively on Spanish abuses, English and Dutch propagandists could create a favorable contrast, implying their own colonial projects would be more benevolent and just, even as they began to engage in their own forms of violence, displacement, and exploitation of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. In essence, the Black Legend was a sophisticated political tool. It was a form of soft power, used to shape international opinion, justify military aggression, and legitimate competing imperial ambitions. Its effectiveness lay in its ability to merge historical accounts with powerful emotional appeals, creating a narrative so compelling that it endured for centuries, shaping not only European perceptions, but also influencing the historical understanding of the Americas for generations. Focus on specific historical events that were used as fodder for the Black Legend, such as the Cholula Massacre, Atahualpa's execution, and conditions in the mines. Explain how these were amplified and distorted for propaganda purposes. Emphasize the role of visual depictions. Conclude by reiterating the selective nature of the legend and its political utility. The power of the Black Legend lay not just in its broad assertions, but in its reliance on specific, often exaggerated examples of Spanish cruelty. These instances, drawn from accounts like Las Casas's short account, were amplified, distorted, and recontextualized to fit the anti-Spanish narrative, becoming potent symbols of Spanish barbarity in the popular imagination. One of the most frequently cited examples was the massacre at Cholula in 1519. While a brutal event where Cortez's forces and their Tlaxcalan allies killed thousands of unarmed inhabitants, often justified by the Spanish as a preemptive strike against a perceived ambush. The Black legend presented it as unprovoked, wanton slaughter, a clear demonstration of Spanish perfidy and bloodlust. The details were often embellished to maximize the horror. The treatment of indigenous leaders also provided fertile ground for the legend. The execution of Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, despite the immense ransom paid for his release, was a particularly damning example. This act of treachery, where a powerful sovereign was summarily executed after being tricked into captivity, solidified the image of the Spanish as utterly untrustworthy and devoid of honor. Similarly, the capture and eventual death of Moctezuma II was framed as an act of cruel subjugation. The conditions in the silver mines, especially Potosí, were also central to the Black legend. Descriptions of indigenous laborers dying in droves from exhaustion, collapses, and mercury poisoning became emblematic of Spanish greed and their disregard for human life. While the conditions were indeed horrific, the legend often implied a deliberate policy of extermination rather than a consequence of ruthless economic exploitation and inadequate safety measures. The encomienda system, with its inherent abuses, was consistently highlighted. Stories of encomenderos whipping, torturing, and starving indigenous people were widely circulated, fueling the image of a system designed for pure oppression rather than the theoretically benevolent, though rarely practiced, protection and Christianization it claimed. Even seemingly minor incidents were often inflated. Accounts of Spanish soldiers using indigenous infants as dog food or engaging in various forms of mutilation, while perhaps based on isolated, horrific acts, were presented as widespread and systemic practices indicative of a national character of cruelty. These specific instances, whether fully accurate or exaggerated, served a crucial purpose in the propaganda war. They provided concrete evidence that resonated with popular fears and prejudices, making the abstract concept of Spanish tyranny feel tangible and immediate. The visual depictions, particularly debris engravings, translated these narratives into powerful images that left a lasting impression, shaping public perception for generations. It is important to acknowledge that the Spanish themselves often recorded these atrocities. The internal debates and self-criticism, as seen with Las Casas, provided the raw material. However, the Black legend selectively picked these details, stripped them of their context, and presented them as the whole truth, devoid of any nuance or counter-evidence. This selective presentation was the hallmark of effective propaganda. While the suffering inflicted by the Spanish was very real and immense, the Black legend's power lay in its ability to simplify, to demonize, and to create a clear villain, serving the political and religious agendas of Spain's rivals, rather than a comprehensive historical understanding.
To truly understand the complex interplay of events, it is essential to move beyond the stark, one-dimensional portrayal of the Black legend and consider the nuances and counter-narratives that complicate its simplistic framework. While acknowledging the immense suffering and exploitation inflicted by the Spanish, a more balanced historical perspective reveals a richer, more contradictory reality. Firstly, the Spanish conquest was not a monolithic, unified enterprise. There were significant internal divisions and conflicts among the conquistadors themselves, as seen in the civil wars in Peru. The crown often struggled to assert its authority over ambitious and independent-minded colonists, leading to constant tensions between royal power and colonial autonomy. Secondly, as highlighted by Bartolomé de las Casas, there was a robust tradition of self-criticism and moral debate within Spain itself, particularly among theologians, jurists, and some members of the clergy. The Valladolid debate, the new laws of 1542, and the extensive legal framework developed by Spain to govern its colonies, however imperfectly applied, demonstrate a genuine, albeit often conflicted, attempt to grapple with the ethical implications of conquest and colonization. No other European power at the time engaged in such public and profound moral introspection regarding their colonial practices. This internal debate provides a crucial counterpoint to the Black legend's portrayal of a universally cruel and unrepentant nation. Thirdly,
The role of indigenous allies in the conquest, particularly in Mexico, is often overlooked by the Black legend. The Tlaxcalans, for example, were crucial to Cortez's victory over the Aztecs. These alliances were not simply a matter of coercion, they reflected complex indigenous politics, rivalries, and strategic calculations. Many indigenous groups saw the Spanish as potential liberators from the dominance of empires like the Aztecs or Incas, or as allies in their own long-standing conflicts. This complicates the narrative of a simple European imposition, revealing the agency of Native Americans in shaping the course of events, often finding ways to preserve their heritage and even thrive in new circumstances. Finally, it's crucial to compare Spanish colonization with that of other European powers. While the Black legend focuses exclusively on Spanish abuses, other colonial powers, including the English, French, and Dutch, also engaged in brutal violence, land dispossession, enslavement, and cultural destruction. The English, for example, pursued a policy of complete removal or extermination of indigenous populations in some areas, rather than the integration, albeit often coercive, seen in the Spanish system. The scale of the transatlantic slave trade, which primarily fueled British and French colonies in the Caribbean and North America, far surpassed that in Spanish America. By acknowledging these nuances, we don't absolve Spain of its historical wrongs, but rather arrive at a more sophisticated understanding of a shared, brutal history of colonialism. The Black legend, while rooted in real atrocities, was ultimately a political weapon. Recognizing its propagandistic nature allows us to move towards a more balanced and complex historical narrative, one that acknowledges both the immense suffering and the intricate human interactions that defined the colonial era, rather than perpetuating a simplified, biased view. The Black legend, born of European rivalries and fueled by centuries of propaganda, has cast a long and enduring shadow over the perception of Spain's role in the Americas, profoundly influencing U.S. history and its understanding of the continent's past. For generations, American textbooks and popular culture often presented a simplified narrative. Noble English settlers escaping tyranny to build a land of freedom, contrasted with the cruel, gold-hungry, and fanatical Spaniards who merely exploited the land and its people. This binary view served to legitimize Anglo-American expansion across the continent, portraying it as a benevolent alternative to Spanish despotism. The very idea of manifest destiny, the belief in America's divinely ordained right to expand westward, implicitly drew on this contrast. The lands previously claimed or settled by Spain and later Mexico were often depicted as underdeveloped or mismanaged, awaiting the superior hand of Anglo-Saxon enterprise. This conveniently overlooked the complex indigenous cultures, the thriving mestizo societies, and the rich history of Spanish-speaking peoples who already inhabited these territories. The legacy of the Black legend in U.S. history contributed to a deep-seated anti-Hispanic prejudice, often manifesting as xenophobia against Mexican immigrants, Latin Americans, and Spanish-speaking communities. It reinforced stereotypes of laziness, cruelty, and backwardness, hindering a full appreciation of the significant contributions of Hispanic cultures to the American mosaic, particularly in the Southwest. In contemporary times, historians and scholars have increasingly challenged the simplistic narrative of the Black legend. Through meticulous research and a commitment to primary sources, they seek to provide a more nuanced and comprehensive understanding of the colonial era. This historical revisionism doesn't deny the atrocities committed by the Spanish, nor does it attempt to whitewash the immense suffering of indigenous populations. Instead, it aims to contextualize these events within the broader sweep of global history, acknowledging the complexities of human motivation, the internal contradictions of colonial powers, and the resilience and agency of all peoples involved. The current focus is on understanding the Columbian exchange in its entirety, the exchange of goods, ideas, diseases, and peoples, and its multifaceted impact.
it emphasizes the concept of transculturation, the process by which cultures interact and influence each other, leading to new hybrid forms. It acknowledges the long-term demographic, linguistic, religious, and architectural legacies of Spanish colonization, which are undeniable parts of the American story. Debates continue, particularly around figures like Christopher Columbus, whose legacy is now fiercely contested. The movement to remove his statues and re-evaluate his role reflects a societal reckoning with the darker aspects of colonization and a growing recognition of indigenous perspectives. This ongoing dialogue underscores the importance of critically examining historical narratives, understanding how they are constructed, and recognizing their impact on contemporary society. In conclusion, the story of the Black legend, Native Americans, and Spaniards is not a simple tale of good versus evil. It is a profoundly human story, filled with ambition, faith, greed, violence, resistance, and resilience. By moving beyond the simplistic caricatures of the Black legend, we can embrace a more accurate, albeit more challenging, understanding of U.S. history and the complex interwoven tapestry of the Americas, fostering a deeper appreciation for the rich diversity that defines our shared past and present. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. We hope you've gained a new perspective and will continue to explore history with us.